I still remember that day like it was yesterday. Some memories fade with time, but not this one. Not the day I faced German soldiers for the first time and barely made it back alive. My name is James Callahan, but everyone called me Jack. I was born in 1923 in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knew your name and your business. I was 20 years old when I shipped out to Europe, full of ideas about glory and heroism that would be beaten out of me faster than I could have ever imagined. Before I continue with this story, I want to ask you something. If you find value in hearing the accounts of those who lived through history, who walked through the fire and came out the other side, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps more people find these stories, and it lets me know that sharing these memories matters to someone out there. Now let me take you back to the summer of 1944. We had landed in Normandy about 3 weeks prior. The beaches were behind us, but the images weren't. They never would be. I had survived Omaha Beach, though survived feels like too strong a word. I had made it through. That's more accurate. My unit, the 29th Infantry Division, had pushed inland through the hedgerow country of France, what the locals called the Bocage. If you've never seen it, let me paint you a picture. Imagine fields divided by walls of earth and vegetation, some of them 6 feet tall or more, so thick with roots and brambles that you couldn't see through them, couldn't shoot through them, and could barely push through them. Every field was a fortress. Every corner could hide a machine gun nest. The Germans knew this terrain, and they used it against us with devastating effectiveness. I was a private first class in Easy Company, 2nd Battalion. Our company had taken heavy casualties on the beach and in the first weeks of fighting. Fresh replacements had come in, young men even greener than I had been when I first arrived. I remember looking at their faces and seeing the same naive hope I had carried, the same belief that they were invincible, that death happened to other people. I wanted to shake them, to tell them to keep their heads down and their mouths shut, but I didn't. I couldn't find the words. Our platoon leader was Lieutenant Thomas McCarthy, a 26-year-old from Boston with a sharp mind and a calm demeanor that steadied us all. He had a way of speaking that made you believe everything was going to be all right, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. Our platoon sergeant was a man named Harold Winters, though nobody called him Harold. He was Sergeant Winters, or just Sergeant, a career soldier who had enlisted in the Depression and found his calling in the army. He had a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen things he never talked about. These 2 men would save my life more times than I could count. The day in question was July 18th, 1944. We had received orders to advance toward a small village called Saint-Lô, a critical crossroads that the Germans were defending with everything they had. Our objective was a farmhouse on the outskirts of the village, a 2-story stone structure that intelligence believed was being used as an observation post. If we could take it, we could provide our artillery with better eyes on the German positions. We set out before dawn, moving through the hedgerows in a column, trying to stay quiet. The morning air was thick with moisture, and a light fog clung to the ground, reducing visibility to maybe 50 yards. I remember the smell of wet grass and earth, the sound of my boots squelching in the mud, the weight of my M1 Garand in my hands. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the Germans could hear it. Our squad was point, which meant we were the first ones into danger. Private Eddie Kowalski was on the far left, a kid from Chicago who talked too much and laughed too loud, but who had proven himself steady under fire. Next to him was Corporal James Green, a quiet man from Alabama who moved through the hedgerows like a ghost. I was in the middle of the formation, with Private First Class William Thompson on my right. Thompson was from California, a former lifeguard who had joined up after Pearl Harbor. Behind us came the rest of the squad, including our assistant squad leader, Corporal Robert Martinez, a Mexican-American from Texas who had faced as much prejudice in the army as he had from the enemy, but who never let it break him. We had been moving for about 2 hours when Green held up his fist, the signal to stop. Everyone froze. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and loud in my ears. Green pointed ahead toward a gap in the hedgerow. Beyond it, I could just make out the shape of the farmhouse through the fog. It was maybe 200 yards away, sitting in the middle of a field with no cover between here and there. This was going to be a shooting gallery. Lieutenant McCarthy moved up to assess the situation. He studied the farmhouse through his binoculars for a long moment, then lowered them with a troubled expression. He called over Sergeant Winters and the squad leaders, and they huddled together, speaking in low voices. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could read their body language. This wasn't going to be easy. The plan was simple, which in combat usually means dangerous. First squad would provide covering fire from our current position. Second squad would swing around to the left and try to flank the farmhouse. Third squad, my squad, would advance directly across the field once first squad engaged. We were the bait, meant to draw the Germans' attention while second squad got into position. I remember looking at the men around me, seeing my own fear reflected in their eyes. Thompson gave me a nervous smile and a thumbs up. Kowalski was muttering something under his breath, probably a prayer or a curse, maybe both. Green was checking his rifle with the calm precision of a man who had done this 100 times before. Martinez was watching our rear, making sure no one snuck up on us while we were focused ahead. First squad opened fire at exactly 700 hours. The morning shattered with the sound of M1 rifles and Browning automatic rifles, a cacophony of violence that still echoes in my dreams. Almost immediately, the Germans responded. Machine gun fire erupted from the farmhouse windows, the distinctive ripping sound of an MG-42, what we called Hitler's buzzsaw. Tracers streaked through the fog like angry fireflies, and I could hear the snap of bullets passing overhead. And then it was our turn. Sergeant Winters gave the signal, and we went over the hedgerow and into the field. I remember the strange detachment I felt in that moment, as if I were watching myself from a distance. My legs were moving, carrying me forward, but my mind seemed disconnected from my body. Time stretched and contracted in impossible ways. Every second felt like an hour, yet the whole advance seemed to take only heartbeats. We were maybe 50 yards into the field when the first man fell. It was Private Henderson, one of the replacements who had joined us just last week. He went down without a sound, crumpling like a marionette with cut strings. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I would die. The ground around me was erupting with impacts, little geysers of dirt and grass where the bullets struck. I could hear them buzzing past my ears, feel the displaced air on my face. It was as if the whole world had become hostile, every atom conspiring to end my life. I ran and fired, not really aiming, just trying to keep the Germans' heads down long enough to close the distance. Thompson was still beside me, his face twisted with determination and terror. We had trained together, shipped out together, survived the beaches together. He was more than a comrade, he was a brother. We had sworn to watch each other's backs, to make it home together. That promise was the only thing keeping me moving forward. And then Thompson fell. He stumbled, his legs giving out beneath him, and pitched face first into the mud. I saw the dark stains spreading across his back, saw his hands clutching at the grass as if trying to hold on to life itself. Without thinking, I changed direction and threw myself down beside him. Bullets were still cracking overhead, impacting all around us, but I didn't care. Thompson was looking up at me with eyes full of confusion and pain. I grabbed him by the straps of his webbing and started dragging him toward a slight depression in the ground, a shell crater from some earlier bombardment. It wasn't much cover, but it was all we had. Thompson was heavier than I expected, or maybe I was weaker than I thought. Every inch felt like a mile. My arms were screaming, my lungs burning, my whole body one giant cramp of exertion and fear. We made it to the crater and tumbled in. I pressed myself against the earth, trying to make myself as small as possible while I assessed Thompson's wound. It was bad. The bullet had entered his upper back and exited through his chest, leaving a ragged hole that bubbled with each breath. He was drowning in his own blood. I tore open his shirt and pressed my hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, but there was too much. The blood kept coming, warm and slick between my fingers. Thompson was looking at me, trying to speak, but only a wet gurgle came out. I told him to hold on, that medics were coming, that he was going to be fine. We both knew I was lying. The battle raged on around us. I could hear the distinctive crack of American rifles and the ripping sound of German machine guns. Somewhere to my left, someone was screaming, a high-pitched wail of agony that cut through everything else. Grenades were exploding, both ours and theirs, and the air was thick with smoke and the smell of cordite and blood. Thompson squeezed my hand. His grip was weak. Nothing like the strong handshake that had greeted me when we first met. He was trying to tell me something, his lips moving soundlessly. I leaned closer, putting my ear next to his mouth. His last word was a name. Sarah. His girl back home, the one he was planning to marry after the war. I promised him I would tell her. It was the only thing I could do. He died there in that shell crater, in a muddy field in France, thousands of miles from the sunny California beaches he loved. He was 21 years old. I don't know how long I stayed there with him. Time had lost all meaning. The battle might have lasted minutes or hours. I couldn't tell. But eventually, I became aware that the firing had slackened. The German machine gun had fallen silent. Voices were calling out in English, our men, telling us to advance, that the farmhouse had fallen. I left Thompson where he lay and climbed out of the crater. The field was littered with bodies, some American, some German. The fog had lifted, and the morning sun was casting long shadows across the carnage. I walked toward the farmhouse in a daze, my uniform soaked with Thompson's blood, my mind struggling to process what had happened. Second Squad had done their job. While we had been drawing fire in the field, they had worked their way around to the side of the farmhouse and hit the Germans from an angle they weren't expecting. The MG-42 crew had been eliminated, and the remaining defenders had surrendered. There were 5 of them, young men in grey uniforms with fear in their eyes, their hands raised above their heads. I looked at them, these enemy soldiers, and felt nothing. Not hatred, not satisfaction, not even relief. Just an empty numbness that would take months to shake. They were just men, like us, caught up in something far bigger than any of us could comprehend. Some of them probably hadn't wanted to fight any more than we had. Some of them were probably just as scared, just as homesick, just as desperate to survive. Lieutenant McCarthy was organizing the consolidation of our position. He looked as exhausted as I felt, dark circles under his eyes, dirt and blood smeared across his face. When he saw me, he put a hand on my shoulder and asked if I was hit. I shook my head. The blood wasn't mine. We had taken the farmhouse, achieved our objective, but the cost had been staggering. Third Squad alone had lost 4 men killed and another 3 wounded. Henderson, Thompson, Kowalski, and a replacement whose name I never learned were dead. Green had taken a round through the arm, but refused evacuation, insisting he could still fight. Martinez had a gash across his forehead from flying debris, which he dismissed as nothing. I spent the rest of that day in a fog, going through the motions of a soldier, while my mind kept returning to that shell crater, to Thompson's eyes, to the name he had whispered with his last breath. Sarah. I wondered what she looked like, whether she was pretty, whether she knew yet that her world had just ended. I wondered how I would find her after the war, what I would say, how I could possibly convey the depths of her loss in words. That night, we dug in around the farmhouse, expecting a German counterattack that never came. I sat in my foxhole, staring up at the stars, the same stars that were shining down on Ohio, on California, on all the places we had left behind. The night was quiet except for the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional crack of a rifle somewhere down the line. Men talked in low voices, shared cigarettes, tried to find some normalcy in the midst of chaos. Sergeant Winters came by to check on me. He didn't say much, just sat beside me for a while, sharing the silence. Eventually he told me that what I had done, trying to save Thompson, dragging him to cover under fire, that took guts. Most men would have kept running. I told him it didn't matter, that Thompson was dead anyway. Winters shook his head. "It matters," he said. "It matters that you tried. It matters that you didn't leave him alone. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Thompson's face, felt the warmth of his blood on my hands. I heard the ripping sound of the MG-42, the snap of bullets, the screams of the wounded. I smelled cordite and copper and the particular stench of a body that has been opened by violence. These sensations would become my constant companions over the months to come, the unwelcome guests at every moment of peace. The next morning, we continued our advance towards Saint-Lô. The hedgerow fighting intensified, and every day brought new battles, new losses, new horrors. But something had changed in me after that first firefight. The naive young man who had shipped out from Ohio was gone, replaced by something harder, something colder. I had learned the most important lesson of war, that survival was mostly a matter of luck, and that luck could run out at any moment. I made it through the rest of the campaign. Saint-Lô fell on July 25th, after weeks of brutal fighting that reduced the town to rubble. We pushed on through France, liberating towns whose names I can't pronounce, and meeting people whose gratitude made all our suffering feel worthwhile. There were more firefights, more close calls, more friends lost. But nothing ever hit me quite as hard as that first encounter, that moment when war stopped being an abstraction and became a visceral, terrible reality. I kept my promise to Thompson. After the war ended, after I made it home to Ohio, I tracked down Sarah Mitchell in San Diego. She was a pretty girl with brown hair and sad eyes, and she already knew, of course. The War Department had sent a telegram months before. But I told her anyway, told her that Thompson's last thought had been of her, that he had died with her name on his lips. She cried, and I cried, and we sat together on her porch as the sun set over the Pacific. Two strangers bound by a man we had both loved in different ways. I'm 97 years old now, one of the few left who can tell these stories from memory. Most of my buddies are gone, claimed by time rather than bullets. Lieutenant McCarthy passed away in 1998, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. Sergeant Winters died in 2005, still tough as nails to the very end. Green, Martinez, Kowalski's brother who survived the war, all of them are gone. Sometimes I feel like a relic, a living artifact from a world that no longer exists. But I keep telling these stories because I believe they matter. Not just for history, but for understanding what war really is. It's not glory or heroism, though sometimes those exist. It's fear and pain and loss. It's holding your friend while he dies in a muddy field, knowing there's nothing you can do to save him. It's the faces of the men you killed, the ones who haunt your dreams for decades afterward. It's the weight of memory that never gets lighter, no matter how many years pass. That day in July 1944, when I faced German soldiers for the first time, I barely made it back. Not just physically, though, that was close enough, but something of who I was stayed in that field, bled out into the French soil alongside Thompson and Henderson and all the others. I came home, but I was never quite whole again. And yet, despite everything, I would do it again. Not for the glory, not for the medals, but for the men beside me, for Thompson and Green and Martinez and all the others, for the belief that some things are worth fighting for, even at terrible cost. We didn't save the world single-handedly, no single person did, but together we held the line. We pushed back against an evil that threatened to consume everything. We did our part. That has to be worth something. I want to talk more about what happened in the days following that first firefight, because healing, both physical and mental, was something none of us really understood back then. There was no talk of post-traumatic stress, no counseling, no acknowledgement that what we were experiencing was tearing us apart inside. We just pushed on day after day, because that's what soldiers did. The morning after we took the farmhouse, I woke up shaking. Not from cold, though the nights could get chilly even in July. It was something deeper, a tremor that started in my core and radiated outward until my whole body was vibrating like a struck tuning fork. I couldn't eat breakfast. The sight of food made my stomach turn. I forced down some water and coffee, and that was all I could manage. Green noticed. Of course he did. Green noticed everything. He sat down beside me without saying a word, just sharing space, and after a while I felt the shaking begin to subside. He had a way of doing that, of making you feel less alone without ever being intrusive. When I finally looked at him, he just nodded, as if to say, "I know. I've been there. You'll get through it." We moved out at 0800, pushing deeper into the bocage. The hedgerows seemed endless, a green maze with death lurking around every corner. Our advance was measured in fields, each one a potential killing ground, each one requiring careful coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. The tanks that were supposed to support us kept getting stuck or ambushed, their thin bottom armor no match for German mines and Panzerfausts. I learned to read the landscape in those days, to see the subtle signs of danger that could mean the difference between life and death. A slight depression that might indicate a covered fighting position. A pattern of broken branches that suggested someone had passed through recently. The way birds fell silent when danger was near and resumed singing when it had passed. These were the skills that kept men alive, passed down from veteran to replacement in an endless cycle of hard-won knowledge. There was another firefight on July 20th, 2 days after the farmhouse. We were advancing through a particularly dense stretch of hedgerow when we walked into an ambush. The Germans had let our point element pass and opened up on the main body, catching us in a murderous crossfire. I hit the ground as bullets cracked overhead, my face pressed into the dirt, my heart hammering against my ribs. The next few minutes were chaos. Men were screaming. Officers were shouting orders. Grenades were exploding. I couldn't see the enemy, couldn't see much of anything except the hedgerow directly in front of me and the boots of the man to my right. I fired in the direction of the muzzle flashes, not knowing if I was hitting anything, just trying to add my rifle to the wall of lead we were throwing at the Germans. Martinez saved us. While the rest of us were pinned down, he crawled along the base of the hedgerow until he found a gap, then worked his way around behind the German position. We heard his bar open up, the distinctive heavy chatter of the Browning, and suddenly the enemy fire slackened. Martinez had taken out their machine gun team, breaking the back of the ambush. The surviving Germans fell back and we pushed through, leaving our own dead and wounded behind for the medics to collect. I found Martinez afterward, sitting against a tree, reloading his bar with hands that were perfectly steady. His face was expressionless, but his eyes told a different story. He had just killed several men at close range, looked into their faces as he pulled the trigger. That does something to you, no matter how justified it might be. I sat down beside him, the way Green had sat with me, and we shared a cigarette in silence. The days blurred together after that. We pushed towards St. Lo through endless hedgerows, fighting for every field, every farmhouse, every crossroads. The town itself was a fortress, and the Germans were determined to hold it. Our artillery pounded the place day and night, reducing buildings to rubble, but still the enemy fought on. I gained respect for them in those days, even as I did my best to kill them. They were good soldiers, well-trained and disciplined, fighting for a cause most of them probably didn't believe in anymore, but refusing to give up. I remember one particular incident that has stayed with me through all these years. We had just cleared a farmhouse after a brief but vicious fight, and I was searching the ground floor when I came across a German soldier who had been wounded and left behind by his comrades. He was young, maybe 18 or 19, with blonde hair and blue eyes, and a face that reminded me of a kid I had gone to school with back in Ohio. He was gut-shot, and we both knew what that meant. It was a death sentence, slow and painful. He was crying, not from fear but from pain, and he kept saying something in German that I couldn't understand. I knelt beside him, not knowing what to do. I could have shot him, ended his suffering, but I couldn't bring myself to pull the trigger. He wasn't a threat anymore. He was just a boy dying in a foreign land, far from everyone who loved him. I gave him water from my canteen and stayed with him until he died. It took about 20 minutes. At some point he grabbed my hand and held it, his grip surprisingly strong for someone so close to death. I don't know why I let him. Maybe because I was thinking of Thompson, of how he had died with someone beside him, and how that had mattered even if it hadn't saved him. Everyone deserves to have someone with them at the end. When it was over, I closed his eyes and moved on. There was more fighting to do, more hedgerows to cross, more friends to lose. But I never forgot that German boy, and I never stopped wondering about his story. Did he have a family back home? Parents who would receive the same kind of telegram that had shattered so many American households? Did he have a girl like Sarah, waiting for him to come back? War reduces people to enemies and allies, targets and friendlies. But underneath all that, we're all just human beings, all equally fragile, all equally afraid. St. Lo finally fell on July 25th, after what felt like an eternity of fighting. I walked through the ruins of the town in a daze, stepping over rubble and debris, past the blackened shells of buildings that had stood for centuries before we came along. The civilians who emerged from their cellars looked at us with a mixture of gratitude and resentment, which I understood. We had liberated them, but we had also destroyed their home in the process. Operation Cobra followed immediately after, the breakout from Normandy that would eventually lead us across France and into Germany itself. But that's a story for another time. The fall of St. Lo marked the end of my first real experience of combat. Those brutal weeks in the hedgerows where I learned what it meant to be a soldier. Looking back now, from the vantage point of nearly 8 decades, I can see how that experience shaped everything that came after. The nightmares that plagued me for years, the difficulty connecting with people who hadn't been there, the way loud noises could send me into a panic long after the war was over. We didn't have a name for it back then, didn't understand that the invisible wounds were just as real as the visible ones. We just called it shell shock and tried to tough it out. But there were good things too. The bonds I formed with the men of my unit, bonds stronger than any I've experienced before or since. The knowledge that I had been part of something important, something that mattered. The pride of having served, of having done my duty, of having faced the worst that human beings can do to each other and somehow come through it. I never became a hero. I didn't win any medals for valor, didn't perform any single act of extraordinary bravery. I just did my job, kept my head down, tried to stay alive and keep the men around me alive. Most soldiers are like that, if we're being honest. The heroes you hear about, the ones who charge machine gun nests and save entire platoons, they're the exception, not the rule. Most of us were just ordinary men doing our best in extraordinary circumstances. But maybe that's heroism enough. Maybe just showing up day after day, facing your fears and doing what needs to be done, maybe that counts for something. I'd like to think it does. I'd like to think that Thompson's death meant something, that all the deaths meant something, that the world we built from the ashes of that terrible war was worth the price we paid. That first firefight, that day when I faced German soldiers and barely made it back, it taught me something I've carried with me ever since. Life is precious and fragile and can be taken away in an instant. Every day we get is a gift, even the hard ones, even the painful ones. Because the alternative is not getting any days at all, is lying in a muddy field in France while your blood soaks into the earth and someone you love whispers your name without ever knowing you're gone. I've had a good life, all things considered. I came home, married a wonderful woman named Dorothy, raised 3 children, watched them have children of their own. I worked as a carpenter for 40 years, building houses and furniture, creating things instead of destroying them. It was healing, that work. Every nail I drove was a small act of creation, a counterweight to all the destruction I had witnessed and participated in. Dorothy passed away in 2015, and I miss her every day. She was the one who pulled me out of the darkness when I came home, who held me through the nightmares, who never asked for explanations I couldn't give. She understood, somehow, even though she had never been there. That's a rare gift, and I was blessed to have it for 67 years. My children have heard these stories before, some of them anyway. There are things I've never told anyone, things that will go to the grave with me, not because they're shameful, necessarily, but because some experiences are too personal to share, too raw, even after all this time. Every veteran has their own collection of unspeakable memories, locked away in the back of their mind, taken out only in the quiet moments when no one else is watching. But this story, the story of that first firefight, I tell because I think it matters, because it shows what war really is, underneath all the movies and books and video games. It's not adventure or excitement. It's terror and loss and the death of innocence. It's holding your friend's hand while he bleeds out and knowing there's nothing you can do. It's killing a young man who probably never wanted to be there any more than you did. And it's surviving. It's getting up the next morning and putting one foot in front of the other, even when every part of you wants to curl up and stop. It's finding reasons to keep going when all your reasons have been torn away. It's learning to live with what you've done and what's been done to you, finding some way to make peace with it. I faced German soldiers for the first time on July 18th, 1944, and I barely made it back. But I did make it back. And every day since then has been borrowed time, a grace period I never expected and never quite felt I deserved. I've tried to use it well, to honor the memory of those who didn't get the same chance, to live a life that Thompson would have been proud of. That's all any of us can do, really, live the best we can with the time we're given and remember those who ran out of time too soon. They're not really gone, not as long as someone remembers them. That's why I keep telling these stories, even when it hurts, even when the memories threaten to overwhelm me. Because as long as I'm talking about Thompson and Henderson and all the others, they're still here in some way, still part of the story, still mattering. And that matters to me more than I can say. War changes you in ways you don't expect. It's not just the obvious things, the nightmares and the jumpiness and the difficulty adjusting to civilian life. It's the small things too, the subtle shifts in how you see the world and your place in it. After facing death so intimately, the petty concerns that used to occupy so much of my attention seemed trivial. Arguments with neighbors, worries about money, the social dramas that had seemed so important before the war, none of it mattered anymore. I had seen what real problems looked like, and everything else paled in comparison. This could be isolating. Coming home, I found it hard to relate to people who hadn't been through what I had. They would complain about their jobs or their relationships, and I would think about Thompson dying in that shell crater, about the German boy I had held while he breathed his last. How could I take their problems seriously when I had seen such things? How could I pretend to care about who was dating whom, or what so-and-so said about someone at a party? It took me years to overcome that, to understand that everyone's problems are real to them, that suffering isn't a competition. Dorothy helped with that. She had her own struggles during the war, working in a factory while I was overseas, worrying every day that she would get that telegram. Her war wasn't the same as mine, but it was still hard, and recognizing that helped me reconnect with the civilian world I had left behind. The nightmares persisted for decades. They've faded now, coming only occasionally, but for the first 30 years after the war, hardly a week went by without waking up in a cold sweat, the sounds of gunfire still ringing in my ears. Dorothy learned to recognize the signs, would hold me until the shaking stopped, never asking questions, just being there. I don't know how she did it, how she absorbed so much of my pain without letting it break her. She was stronger than me in ways I never fully appreciated until she was gone. I joined a veterans group after the war, mostly at Dorothy's urging. It helped to talk to men who had been through similar experiences, who understood without needing explanations. We would meet at the American Legion Hall every month, share stories over beer, laugh about things that weren't really funny, because laughing was better than crying. Some of those men became lifelong friends. Most of them are gone now, but I still remember their faces, their voices, their particular ways of telling a story or making a joke. The reunions were harder. The division held them every few years, and I attended when I could. But they always left me feeling melancholy. Seeing the men I had served with, watching them age, remembering those who were no longer there to attend, it was a reminder of how much time had passed, how much had been lost. The last reunion I attended was in 2010, when there were only a handful of us left. We sat in a hotel ballroom that had once been filled with hundreds, and we talked about the old days, and we knew it was probably the last time we would all be together. I think about legacy a lot these days. What will remain when I'm gone? My children and grandchildren, of course, the houses I built, some of which are still standing, the stories I've told, preserved now in videos like this one. But beyond that, I hope that my life has touched others in some positive way, that the kindness I've tried to show has rippled outward, affecting people I'll never meet. And I hope that these stories serve as a reminder. War is not to be taken lightly. It's not a game or an adventure. It's a last resort to be avoided when possible and endured when necessary. The men who served in World War II, the ones they called the greatest generation, we weren't great because we wanted to fight. We were great, if we were great at all, because we did what had to be done, even when it terrified us, even when it cost us everything. That first firefight taught me that I could face death and keep moving. It taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. It taught me that the bonds between soldiers are forged in fire and can never be broken, no matter how many years pass or how far apart we end up. And it taught me that life is a precious, fragile thing, not to be wasted on anger or regret or the petty grievances that consume so many people. Thompson would have been 97 this year, same as me. I wonder sometimes what his life would have been like if he had made it home. Would he have married Sarah? Would they have had children, grandchildren? Would he have found happiness, built a good life, grown old, surrounded by people who loved him? These questions don't have answers, but I ask them anyway, because asking them keeps Thompson alive in my memory. I still have his dog tags. Sarah gave them to me after I visited her, said she wanted someone who had been there to have them. I've kept them in my desk drawer for 75 years, a small piece of metal stamped with a name and a serial number, all that remains of a young man who deserved so much more time. Sometimes I take them out and hold them, feeling the weight of history in my palm, remembering a sunny afternoon in San Diego and a woman's tear-stained face and a promise made in a shell crater in France. That's what war leaves behind. Dog tags and memories, and the weight of all the unlived lives, all the stories that were cut short. It's not glorious or romantic. It's just loss, piled upon loss, stretching back through the generations. Every war leaves its mark, and those marks never fully heal. But we carry on, we remember, we tell our stories, and we hope against all evidence that somehow, someday, humanity will learn to settle its differences without sending its young men and women to kill and die in foreign fields. I'm not naive enough to believe this will happen in my lifetime, or perhaps ever, but I hope for it anyway. I hope because the alternative, accepting that war is inevitable, is too bleak to contemplate. I faced German soldiers for the first time on July 18th, 1944. I barely made it back, but I did make it back, and I've spent the 80 years since then trying to live a life worthy of the sacrifice of those who didn't. I don't know if I've succeeded. That's not for me to judge. But I've tried my best, and in the end, that's all any of us can do. Thank you for listening to this old man's memories. I know these stories aren't easy to hear, but I believe they're important. The generation that fought World War II is almost gone now. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers what it was really like, who can speak from first-hand experience about the terror and the loss and the strange, terrible beauty of young men at war. These videos, these testimonies, they're all that will remain. So remember us. Remember Thompson and Henderson and the German boy whose name I never knew. Remember the hedgerows of Normandy and the ruins of St. Lo and the countless fields where young men's blood soaked into the earth. Remember that freedom has a price, and that price is paid by people just like you and me, ordinary folks who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and did the best they could. And when you hear people talk about war as if it were a game or an adventure, remember this story. Remember a young private first class holding his dying friend in a muddy shell crater, making promises he wasn't sure he could keep, learning in the hardest possible way what it really means to be a soldier. That's my story. That's what I wanted to share with you today. The day I faced German soldiers for the first time and barely made it back. It was the worst day of my life in many ways, but also the day that defined me, that made me who I am. I've carried it with me for 80 years, and I'll carry it until the day I die. Maybe that's enough. Maybe just carrying it, just remembering, just bearing witness to history, maybe that's all I was ever supposed to do. If so, I'm content with that. I'm content with being a keeper of memories, a teller of tales, a bridge between the past and the present. Thank you for listening. And God bless America, and God bless all those who serve.